A spilled coffee? A car accident? A misunderstanding that spirals out of control? She was just a waitress trying to make ends meet. He was a CEO with no patience for mistakes. They were never supposed to cross paths, let alone collide in the most disastrous ways possible. But when fate keeps throwing them together, tension turns to sparks, and secrets start to unravel. Lies, betrayals, and one life-changing revelation will force them to question everything they thought they knew. Enemies, rivals, or something more. One mistake started it all, but will love be enough to fix it? Don't miss out on this roller coaster of emotions. Subscribe to our YouTube channel now and be the first to dive into the drama. David pushed open the glass door of the Daily Grind, the small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, but he barely noticed. His mind was occupied with the string of emails he had skimmed through on his phone, each one adding another layer of frustration. His company was in the middle of a major acquisition, and every delay, every small error, felt like a personal affront to his efficiency. He hated inefficiency. He stepped up to the counter, barely looking at the menu. His voice was clipped, precise. Large black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Sarah, exhausted from her double shift, nodded and punched in the order. She had been running around all morning, dealing with impatient customers, and her feet were aching. She had noticed David the moment he walked in. He had that air of someone important, someone who thought the world should move at his pace. She had seen plenty of men like him. She grabbed the cup hastily, but as she turned, her elbow caught the edge of a tray, and before she could react, the steaming coffee tipped forward, spilling directly onto the crisp white shirt of the man standing in front of her. A sharp intake of breath. David jerked back, his eyes widening in shock as the hot liquid seeped into his expensive shirt. The silence in the cafe was deafening for a moment, then his expression darkened. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like ice. Sarah's heart dropped. I, I'm so sorry, she stammered, grabbing napkins in a frantic attempt to help. David took a step back, brushing her hands away, as if the mere thought of her touching him would make things worse. His jaw clenched, his voice low but dripping with irritation. "Do you have any idea how much this shirt costs?" Sarah bristled. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he said them, like she was beneath him, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay professional. "I can offer to pay for the dry cleaning," she said, though she knew full well that whatever brand he was wearing probably cost more than her monthly rent. David let out a humorless laugh. "Right, sure. With what? Your tips?" he scoffed, shaking his head in exasperation. Sarah felt her face heat up with embarrassment, but she bit her tongue. Apologizing again wouldn't change his attitude. She had dealt with enough difficult customers to know when someone had already decided they were above her. David exhaled sharply, glancing at his watch. He was already late. With one last look of annoyance, he muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable," before turning on his heel and storming out of the cafe, leaving Sarah standing there, coffee-stained napkins still clutched in her hands. She swallowed down the lump in her throat, blinking rapidly. Just another difficult customer. Just another day. But somehow this encounter felt different. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the bustling city streets. Sarah sighed as she maneuvered her small, slightly battered car through the evening traffic. She was exhausted after another long shift at the Daily Grind, and all she could think about was getting home, kicking off her shoes, and maybe, if she had the energy, watching an episode of whatever show she hadn't finished last week. At the same time, a sleek black sedan was moving steadily through the next lane. Behind the wheel, David was checking his watch impatiently. His meeting had run late, and now he was stuck in traffic, his mood souring by the minute. His assistant had emailed him 3 times about an urgent contract revision, and he just wanted to get home, shower, and forget about this long, frustrating day. Then it happened. Sarah, distracted for a fraction of a second by the sound of a honking car behind her, accidentally misjudged the space as she tried to switch lanes. A sudden scraping sound echoed through the street as her car grazed the side of the black sedan next to her. Her stomach dropped. "Oh no, 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 no," she muttered, gripping the steering wheel as she pulled over to the side of the road. David, meanwhile, had gone rigid in his seat. His jaw clenched as he slowly turned his head to assess the damage. A thin but very visible scratch ran along the side of his car. He exhaled sharply, his patience completely evaporating. With controlled irritation, he pulled over behind her and stepped out, already expecting to deal with some reckless, inexperienced driver. But when Sarah emerged from her car, his eyes widened for a split second before narrowing into disbelief. "You," he said flatly. Sarah froze mid-step. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she muttered under her breath before forcing an apologetic smile. "Look, I'm really sorry." "Unbelievable," David cut her off, dragging a hand through his hair in frustration. "First you spill coffee all over me, and now you're trying to wreck my car? Do you just have a personal vendetta against me, or are you always this careless?" Sarah bristled at his words. "It was an accident," she said firmly, trying to keep her cool. "I miscalculated the distance. I wasn't trying to—" "Oh, well, that makes it so much better," David said sarcastically, crossing his arms. "Maybe next time, try paying a little more attention instead of, what, daydreaming? Being on your phone?" Sarah's patience was running thin. She had already been exhausted before this, and now this arrogant CEO was acting like she had totaled his car. "I wasn't on my phone," she said, her voice clipped. "I was just distracted for a second, and it's just a small scratch." David let out a dry laugh. "A small scratch? Do you have any idea how much this car costs?" he said, shaking his head. Sarah bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing down the urge to snap back. "Look, I can give you my insurance info," she offered, "or pay for the repairs, whatever you prefer." David glanced at the scratch again. It wasn't that bad, but that wasn't the point. The point was her. This girl who seemed to constantly cross his path in the most inconvenient ways. "Forget it," he muttered, turning away. "Wait, what?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Just whatever. I don't have time for this," he said over his shoulder as he walked back to his car. "Just stay out of my way from now on." He got in and slammed the door, driving off before Sarah could say anything else. She let out a frustrated sigh, staring at the fading taillights. "Out of your way? Trust me, I'd love nothing more." With a deep breath, she climbed back into her car and pulled back into the road, shaking her head. Of all the people in the city, why did it have to be him again? David hadn't planned on returning to the daily grind. In fact, after the disastrous coffee incident and then the ridiculous car scrape, he had every intention of avoiding the place altogether. But life, it seemed, had other plans. His office was only a few blocks away, and the daily grind made the strongest coffee in the area. If he had to choose between tolerating mediocre coffee or tolerating her, he begrudgingly chose the latter. The first time he walked in after the accident, Sarah nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. "Oh, come on," she muttered under her breath. She quickly turned away, pretending to wipe down the counter, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't notice her. But of course that was impossible. David had already spotted her the second he walked in. His expression tightened for a brief moment before he exhaled sharply, as if mentally preparing himself for yet another unwanted encounter. He walked straight to the counter, barely sparing Sarah a glance. "Large black coffee," he said flatly. Sarah forced herself to remain professional, though her fingers clenched slightly as she worked the machine. She could feel his presence like an annoying storm cloud looming over her morning shift. Over the next few days, this pattern repeated itself. David would walk in, order his usual with the same clipped tone, and sit at his usual spot near the window, sipping his coffee in silence while scrolling through his phone or reviewing documents. He never spoke to Sarah unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, his words were brief, businesslike, devoid of anything resembling warmth. Sarah, for her part, did her best to ignore him, but that was easier said than done. Every time she turned around, he was there. His sharp suit, his unreadable expression, his very presence a reminder of every disastrous interaction they'd had. And then came the mistakes. It started small. The first time, she accidentally handed him a latte instead of his usual black coffee. "Excuse me," David said, holding up the cup with a frown. What is this? Sarah blinked at the foam art on top. Oh, a latte? She said sheepishly. Do I look like someone who drinks lattes? His voice was calm, but laced with irritation. You definitely don't look like someone who drinks anything with a hint of joy, she muttered under her breath, before quickly grabbing the cup back. David narrowed his eyes. What was that? Nothing, she said quickly. I'll get your black coffee. The next time she mixed up his order with another customer's, giving him a hazelnut-flavored coffee. The moment he took a sip, his face twisted in mild horror. Did you just poison me? He asked dryly, setting the cup down as if it were toxic. Sarah crossed her arms. It's just hazelnut syrup. Some people actually enjoy flavor in their drinks. Well, I'm not some people, David muttered, pushing the cup aside. Sarah rolled her eyes and made him another. The worst mistake, however, happened during a particularly busy morning. Flustered and overwhelmed with orders, Sarah grabbed the wrong tray and ended up spilling a small splash of hot coffee onto his sleeve. For a split second, neither of them moved. Sarah's eyes widened in pure horror. David slowly looked down at his sleeve, then back up at her. You have got to be kidding me, he said, voice completely devoid of emotion. Sarah felt like sinking into the floor. I swear this wasn't on purpose. David closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, then exhaled through his nose. He looked like a man desperately holding onto the last shred of his patience. Of course it wasn't, he said tersely. Sarah immediately grabbed some napkins and tried to help, but David took a step back, holding up a hand. Don't, he said simply. That single word was enough to make her freeze. The tension between them was palpable. Neither of them spoke as David grabbed his fresh coffee from the counter and walked away, muttering something under his breath that Sarah was certain wasn't polite. As he sat down at his usual spot, flipping open his laptop, Sarah let out a long sigh and leaned against the counter. This man is going to be the death of me, she muttered, rubbing her temples. From his seat, David took a slow sip of his coffee, glancing at Sarah briefly before turning his attention back to his screen. He wasn't sure why, but something about her always left him feeling just a little more irritated than usual. The afternoon air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh pastries and roasted coffee from the daily grind out onto the busy sidewalk. David stepped out of the cafe, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. He had a few minutes before his next meeting, just enough time to skim through some reports. As he walked past the outdoor seating area, something caught his eye. Sarah was standing near the cafe's entrance, crouched down beside a man sitting on the pavement. He was clearly homeless. His clothes were worn, his hands rough and weathered from exposure to the elements. David wouldn't have paid much attention, except he noticed Sarah was handing him a bag, one of the cafe's signature brown paper bags. Here, she said gently, placing the bag in the man's hands. It's fresh. I made sure they didn't over-toast the bread this time. The man's face lit up with a grateful smile. Thank you, miss. You're always too kind. Just eat while it's warm, okay? She said with a small smile, standing up and dusting off her apron. David slowed his steps. She always did this. For a moment, he just watched. She wasn't looking around to see if anyone noticed her. She wasn't waiting for praise. She just smiled, gave the man a quick pat on the shoulder, and turned back toward the cafe like this was nothing out of the ordinary for her. David frowned slightly, taking a sip of his coffee as he observed her return inside. Was this some sort of act? It wouldn't be the first time he had seen people put on a show of kindness for appearance's sake. He had been in the corporate world long enough to know that generosity was often just another performance, a carefully curated image rather than genuine compassion. And yet, something about the way Sarah had spoken to that man didn't seem fake. She wasn't just tossing him food like she was fulfilling some moral obligation. She had spoken to him with familiarity, like she actually knew him. David shook his head, brushing the thought away. It didn't change anything. She was still careless, still frustrating, still the same girl who had spilled coffee on him and scratched his car. Still, his eyes flickered back toward the cafe window, where Sarah was laughing with a coworker as she wiped down the counter. For reasons he didn't fully understand, David found himself noticing her more after that. Not that he would ever admit it. The cafe was packed, busier than usual. The lunchtime rush had brought in a swarm of customers, leaving the daily grind buzzing with conversation, clinking cups, and the occasional shout of an impatient order. Sarah finally got a short break after working nonstop for hours. She grabbed her sandwich and coffee, scanning the cafe for an empty seat, only to find that every table was occupied. Her gaze swept toward the back corner, where one lone seat remained. Unfortunately, it was across from him. David was sitting at his usual spot, focused on his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. A half-finished black coffee sat beside him, untouched for the last 10 minutes. Sarah hesitated, anywhere but there, but her feet were already aching, and standing for another 15 minutes just to avoid him seemed ridiculous. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and walked over. "Hey," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Do you mind if I sit here? Everywhere else is full." David barely glanced up before gesturing vaguely at the chair across from him. "Do whatever you want." Sarah rolled her eyes at his usual lack of enthusiasm, but pulled out the chair anyway. She unwrapped her sandwich, trying to ignore the awkward tension between them. For a few minutes, they sat in silence. Sarah eating, David typing. It wasn't comfortable, but at least they weren't arguing. Then out of nowhere, David spoke. "Do you plan on working here forever?" Sarah nearly choked on her bite of food. She swallowed hard and frowned at him. "Excuse me?" David looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. "I just mean," he gestured vaguely, "you seem smart, capable. This doesn't seem like the kind of job you'd want long-term." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. She hesitated, then sighed. "No, it's not." David raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Sarah stared down at her coffee cup, tracing the rim with her thumb. "I was studying to become a doctor," she admitted. "I got into med school, but I had to drop out after the first year." David's fingers paused over his keyboard. He hadn't expected that. "Why?" Sarah exhaled softly. "Family reasons. My mom got sick, and the bills piled up fast. I couldn't keep up with tuition and support her at the same time, so I had to make a choice." For a moment, David said nothing. He knew what it was like to have responsibilities that pulled you in different directions, to be forced into choices that felt unfair. "That's unfortunate," he said finally, his tone quieter than before. Sarah let out a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, life's unfair. What can you do?" David studied her for a moment. She wasn't looking for pity. She wasn't bitter. She was just resigned. Something about that didn't sit right with him. But before he could think too much about it, Sarah straightened up and forced a small smile. "Anyway, I don't mind working here. The pay sucks, and some customers are the worst." She shot him a pointed look, to which he raised an eyebrow. "But it's honest work, and at least I still get to help people in small ways." David leaned back in his chair, considering her words. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time he didn't just see her as the girl who spilled coffee on him or scratched his car. He saw someone who had dreams, someone who had lost something. And though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he felt something uncomfortably close to understanding. Still, he wasn't about to let this strange moment of connection linger. "Your sandwich is crooked," he remarked, nodding toward the way it was lopsided in her hand. Sarah stared at him before groaning. "Oh my God, you're impossible." David smirked slightly and went back to his laptop. Maybe this wasn't the worst lunch break he'd had. David had stayed longer at the daily grind than he had intended. His inbox was a mess, his schedule packed with back-to-back meetings, and for some inexplicable reason, he found himself working better at this cafe, despite the questionable company that frequently surrounded him. He had just finished reviewing a contract when he heard a voice from behind the counter. I know, I'm trying, but I just don't have the money right now." Sarah's voice was low but urgent, carrying a sharp edge of frustration. David wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but she was standing only a few feet away near the cafe's storage room, her back partially turned toward him. "No, I don't need a lecture, okay? I just need a little more time. I'll figure it out. David's fingers paused over his keyboard. He hadn't meant to pay attention, but the irritation in Sarah's tone caught his interest. I already used the last of my savings. What else do you want me to do? She sighed, rubbing her forehead. I don't exactly have a rich benefactor paying my bills. There was a pause, followed by a frustrated groan. No, I don't want to borrow more. I'll work extra shifts or something. I'll figure it out. Then came the final blow. It's not like I blew the money on anything stupid. David's jaw clenched. He wasn't sure why, but something about that sentence didn't sit right with him. He had met plenty of people in his life who made reckless financial choices, people who spent impulsively, who buried themselves in debt over luxuries they didn't need, people who made excuses, always playing the victim. Was she one of them? She had mentioned dropping out of med school. Maybe she had wasted money before reality hit her. Maybe she had been irresponsible with her finances and was now dealing with the consequences. The idea irritated him more than it should have. Why was he even thinking about this? With a sharp exhale, David snapped his laptop shut and stood up, making his way toward the exit. As he passed the counter, Sarah stepped out of the storage room, shoving her phone back into her pocket. Their eyes met briefly, and for a second, Sarah seemed startled, almost as if she wondered if he had heard. David said nothing. He simply gave her a look, one laced with disapproval, before pushing open the cafe door and walking out. Sarah stood there, blinking after him, her stomach twisting uncomfortably. What the hell was that about? She muttered to herself. She had no idea that David's already low opinion of her had just sunk even lower. The cafe was packed, the afternoon rush in full swing. The daily grind was a chaotic blur of orders being shouted, espresso machines hissing, and customers chattering over the low hum of indie music playing through the speakers. Sarah was running on pure muscle memory at this point, taking orders, pouring drinks, dodging trays, and forcing polite smiles despite the exhaustion tugging at her bones. Then he showed up. The man was a middle-aged businessman, dressed in an expensive suit, but his expression screamed entitlement. From the moment he stepped up to the counter, Sarah knew he was going to be a problem. Took you long enough, the man scoffed, tapping his fingers impatiently on the counter. I ordered 5 minutes ago. Sarah maintained her customer service smile. I'm really sorry about the wait, sir. We're handling a lot of orders right now, but I'll get yours out as soon as possible. That's not my problem, the man sneered. Maybe if you actually did your job properly, instead of standing around looking clueless, I wouldn't have to wait. Sarah felt her patience snap, but only internally. She had dealt with plenty of customers like this before. The trick was to stay calm, get them what they wanted, and not take the bait. I understand, sir, she said evenly. I'll have your order ready in just a moment. But the man wasn't done. You understand? Really? He let out a dry chuckle, looking her up and down with clear disdain. Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who barely understands how to pour coffee. No wonder you're stuck working here. Sarah froze. That one hit differently. Before she could figure out how to respond, another voice cut through the air, calm but laced with something dangerously sharp. That's enough. Sarah turned her head sharply, completely taken aback. David. He was standing a few feet away, his coffee cup still in hand. But his gaze was locked onto the man with an unmistakable coldness. The businessman blinked in surprise. Excuse me? David took a step closer, his voice casual, but edged with steel. You heard me, he said. You got your order. If you're that impatient, go find another cafe. But don't stand here insulting the staff like some spoiled child throwing a tantrum. The cafe went silent. A few nearby customers turned their heads, sensing the tension. Sarah's mouth opened slightly in shock. What the hell? The businessman scoffed, clearly thrown off. And who exactly do you think you are? David's expression didn't change. He took a slow sip of his coffee before responding, his voice as effortlessly condescending as ever. Someone who doesn't have time to listen to insecure men try to feel important by belittling others, he said smoothly. The man's face reddened, but under the weight of David's icy stare, he didn't push further. Instead, with an annoyed huff, he snatched his drink off the counter and stormed out. The second he was gone, the tension in the cafe dissipated. Conversations resumed, espresso machines whirred back to life, and everything seemed to return to normal. Everything except for Sarah, who was still standing there, utterly dumbfounded. She turned to David, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Did you just—" She gestured vaguely toward the door. "Defend me?" David sighed as if he was already regretting it. "Don't make a big deal out of it." Sarah gawked at him. What?" David took another sip of his coffee, completely unbothered. "I just don't like watching idiots act like they're better than everyone else," he said casually. Then after a beat, he added, "Well, except for myself, of course." Sarah blinked. "You're unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she turned back to continue working, something unsettled lingered in her chest. David Hadley, the same man who had treated her like an incompetent disaster since the day they met, had just offended her, and she had no idea why. The next morning at the daily grind, Sarah was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine when she saw him walk in. David Hadley. After what had happened yesterday, she had no idea how to act around him. One second he was criticizing her, the next he was defending her. What was his deal? She didn't have much time to think about it, because before she could even decide to ignore him, he was already standing at the counter, his usual unreadable expression in place. "Large black coffee," he said as always. Sarah arched an eyebrow, waiting for something more. David exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck before finally looking at her. His voice was controlled, almost reluctant when he spoke again. "About yesterday." Sarah blinked, surprised. "Yeah?" He paused as if choosing his words carefully. Then, in the most emotionally detached tone possible, he said, "I suppose I may have been somewhat harsh before." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Before?" David cleared his throat, his fingers tapping against the counter. "In general." Sarah folded her arms, unimpressed. "Wait, is this you apologizing?" she asked, trying to hold back a smirk. David gave her a flat look. "I wouldn't go that far." Sarah let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Wow, that might be the worst apology I've ever heard." David sighed, as if deeply regretting even starting this conversation. "Fine, if you insist on making a spectacle out of it." He exhaled, then met her gaze with an almost painfully forced sense of acknowledgement. "I'm sorry for being unnecessarily difficult." Sarah tilted her head, pretending to think. No mention of being rude? Or, treating me like an inconvenience since the day we met?" David's jaw tightened slightly. "Don't push it," Sarah snorted. "Unbelievable. Even when you're saying sorry, you sound like you're doing me a favor." David rolled his eyes. "Do you want the apology or not?" Sarah sighed dramatically. "Fine. I'll accept your half-hearted, ego-filled attempt at an apology." She grabbed a cup and started making his coffee. David simply shook his head. "You really don't know how to let things go, do you?" Sarah smirked. "Nope, and I think it bothers you." David didn't respond, just watched as she handed him his coffee. He took it, fingers brushing against hers for half a second before he pulled back. As he turned to leave, Sarah couldn't help but call out, "Hey, David!" He stopped but didn't turn around. "Next time you apologize, try sounding a little less like a king addressing his lowly subjects." David let out a humorless chuckle. "Noted." And just like that, he walked out the door, leaving Sarah shaking her head with a bemused smile. Their truce, if it could even be called that, was fragile at best. Their relationship, still a mess of misunderstandings, sarcasm, and tension. And somehow Sarah knew this wasn't the end of it. The bell above the door chimed as a new customer stepped into the daily grind. Sarah glanced up from the counter and immediately recognized him. Dr. Mark Sullivan. He was a regular, one of those friendly, effortlessly charming types who always had a warm smile and an easygoing presence. Unlike some other customers, he never acted entitled, never snapped at baristas for being too slow, and most importantly, he treated people like actual human beings. "Hey, Sarah," Mark greeted as he approached the counter, flashing his usual friendly smile. Sarah smiled back, already reaching for his usual order. "Hey, Doc." Usual caramel macchiato? Mark leaned against the counter, pretending to think. You know what? Surprised me today. Sarah chuckled. Living on the edge, huh? Gotta keep life exciting somehow, Mark joked, running a hand through his neatly styled brown hair. Unbeknownst to Sarah, across the cafe, David Hadley had just walked in. He was halfway toward the counter when he froze, his gaze landing on the scene before him. Sarah, who usually greeted customers with a polite but tired smile, was actually smiling for real, laughing even. And the man standing in front of her, a well-dressed, good-looking doctor, leaning in just a little too close for David's liking. David's jaw tightened. He didn't know why, but something about the casual ease between them, the way Sarah actually looked relaxed around this guy, bothered him. And when Mark reached over to grab the drink Sarah had made for him, his fingers brushing lightly against hers, David felt an unexpected irritation rise in his chest. What the hell was that? Shoving the thought away, David strode toward the counter, his presence unmistakable. Sarah glanced up and immediately sighed. Oh, great, you're back. David gave her a dry look. Believe me, I wish I wasn't. Mark raised an eyebrow at the exchange, looking between them with mild curiosity. You two know each other? Sarah scoffed. Oh, we've had the pleasure of interacting more than I'd like. David took a sip of his freshly brewed resentment. Trust me, it's mutual. Mark chuckled. Huh, I've never seen Sarah this, what's the word, lively toward a customer. He turned to her, grinning. You must really like him. Sarah let out a laugh so sharp it was almost painful. Oh, absolutely. He's my favorite. David gave a tight smile. Glad to hear it. Mark, oblivious to the growing tension between them, extended a hand toward David. I'm Mark, by the way. I'm a doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital. David stared at the offered handshake for a second too long before reluctantly shaking it. David Hadley. His voice was clipped, impersonal. Mark's smile didn't waver. Good to meet you. So, are you a regular here? Unfortunately, Sarah rolled her eyes. He keeps coming back despite claiming to hate this place. Interesting, Mark mused. Sounds like a classic case of denial to me. David shot him a look. I don't do denial. Sure, buddy, Mark said, unconvinced as he took a sip of his coffee. Sarah, meanwhile, was watching David closely. For someone who usually looked bored with everything, David seemed oddly tense right now, almost as if something about Mark's presence was annoying him. Was he jealous? No, that was ridiculous, right? Sarah shook the thought away and turned to Mark. Enjoy your drink, Doc. Let me know if you actually like my surprise pick. Will do, Mark said with a wink before heading to his usual seat. David watched him go, something unreadable flickering across his face. Sarah noticed. Something wrong? She asked innocently, tilting her head. David took a sip of his coffee, his gaze lingering where Mark had gone. Not at all, he said smoothly. But Sarah wasn't convinced, and as David took his usual seat, pretending to be absorbed in his laptop, his eyes subtly flicked back toward where Mark was sitting. For some reason, he couldn't seem to ignore him. Sarah stood outside the hospital, gripping her phone so tightly her fingers turned white. Her breath came out in short, uneven bursts as she tried to process what the doctor had just told her. Your mother needs surgery immediately. The sooner, the better. But the cost. The numbers had blurred in her mind the moment they were spoken. It was too much, far beyond anything she could afford. Her savings? Gone. Her shifts at the cafe? Barely enough to cover rent. Taking out a loan? She'd never be able to pay it back in time. She leaned against the cold wall of the hospital corridor, trying to steady herself. What was she supposed to do? The next day at the daily grind, Sarah wasn't herself. Her usual energy was gone. She moved mechanically, making drinks, wiping down tables, and answering customers with a hollow politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes. And David noticed. He had spent weeks convincing himself that he didn't care about Sarah beyond her being a mildly competent barista who happened to frequently annoy him. But today, something was off. She wasn't throwing sarcastic remarks his way. She wasn't rolling her eyes at his requests. In fact, she barely acknowledged him at all. And for some reason, that irritated him. "You're being unusually quiet," he remarked as she placed his coffee on the counter. Sarah blinked as if she had just remembered he was there. "Huh? Oh, yeah, just tired." David didn't believe her. But before he could say anything else, another voice cut in. "Hey, Sarah." "Mark." David immediately tensed as the doctor walked up to the counter, his expression gentle but concerned. "You okay?" Mark asked, scanning her face. Sarah hesitated for half a second before sighing. "Not really." David's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "What happened?" Mark asked. Sarah glanced around, lowering her voice. "It's my mom. She needs surgery, but the cost is... It's insane, Mark. I don't know how I'm going to manage it." David's grip on his cup stilled. Mark frowned. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me sooner?" Sarah let out a humorless laugh. "Because there's nothing you can do, unless you magically have thousands of dollars lying around?" Mark didn't even hesitate. "Let me help." Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "I mean it," Mark said seriously. "I have connections at the hospital. I can talk to someone, maybe work something out. And if it comes down to it, I'll cover part of the cost. You don't have to do this alone." David's jaw clenched. Something about Mark's casual generosity made his stomach twist in a way he didn't like. Sarah, however, looked torn. "Mark, I can't just accept that. It's too much." "It's not too much if it helps," Mark countered. "Sarah, you've been working yourself to the bone. Let me do this." David had heard enough. Without thinking, he set his coffee down with a sharp clink and stood up. Sarah and Mark both turned toward him, surprised. "Are you done?" David asked, his voice colder than he intended. Sarah frowned. "Excuse me?" David exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Standing here, acting like there's no other way. Like you have no options except to rely on someone else to fix everything for you." Sarah's eyes flashed with irritation. "David, you don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he challenged. Mark stepped in. "David, this isn't your business." David ignored him, eyes locked on Sarah. "So what's your plan?" he asked, voice low. "Let him play hero while you sit back and wait for a solution?" Sarah saw red. "What the hell is your problem?" she snapped. "You think I want this? That I enjoy feeling helpless?" David didn't flinch. "Then do something about it." For a moment, they just stood there, tension crackling between them. Sarah was furious. Mark was confused. And David was angry at himself. Angry at the fact that he even cared. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Sarah let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through her hair. "What is wrong with that man?" she muttered. Mark sighed. "I have no idea, but I think he cares more than he's willing to admit." Sarah scoffed. "That was impossible, right?" David didn't understand why he was doing this. He wasn't the type to waste time on things that didn't concern him. And yet, here he was, standing outside the administrative office of Westbridge Medical School, Sarah's former university. It had taken a few calls and some light persuasion, read leveraging his connections, to set up a meeting with one of the professors. He had framed it as a professional inquiry, an interest in a former student who had left the program. And while that wasn't entirely a lie, the truth was far less professional and much more personal. A few minutes later, he was sitting across from Dr. Harold Bennett, a well-respected professor in the medical field. The older man adjusted his glasses and studied David with mild curiosity. "You're inquiring about Sarah Walker?" Dr. Bennett asked, steepling his fingers. David nodded. "That's right. She was a student here, wasn't she?" The professor let out a thoughtful hum. "Yes, she was. One of the most promising students I've ever taught, in fact." David blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Promising?" he repeated. "Brilliant, actually," Dr. Bennett said, leaning back in his chair. Sarah had an exceptional understanding of medicine. She was driven, hardworking, and had a natural instinct for patient care. If circumstances had been different, I have no doubt she would have made an outstanding doctor. David felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. Then why did she leave? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. Dr. Bennett sighed, his expression turning somber. Financial difficulties. She tried to keep up with tuition and expenses, but when her mother fell ill, she had to make a choice. She withdrew from the program midway through her first year. David's fingers curled slightly against his knee. She never told anyone? Oh, we tried to offer assistance, Dr. Bennett said, shaking his head. Scholarships, grants. But Sarah was too proud. She didn't want handouts. She insisted on handling things herself, and when she realized she couldn't, she walked away rather than burden others. David stared at the professor, his mind racing. All this time, he had assumed the worst about Sarah, thought she was irresponsible, careless with money, maybe even reckless with her life choices. But the truth? She had sacrificed everything for her family. She had given up her own future to take care of her mother. And she hadn't asked for pity, hadn't expected help. She had just dealt with it. David sat back, exhaling slowly. He had been so wrong about her. Dr. Bennett studied him for a moment before speaking again. I take it you know Sarah personally? David hesitated, then nodded. Something like that. The professor's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. Then you should know. People like Sarah don't come around often. She may not be a doctor right now, but she has the heart of one. And if she ever gets another chance, she won't waste it. David left the university with a mind full of thoughts and a chest full of something he couldn't quite name. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Sarah through the lens of his prejudices. For the first time, he saw who she truly was. Sarah sat at the hospital's billing office, staring at the numbers on the printed invoice in front of her. It was the same crushing total as before, an amount so impossibly high it made her stomach twist into knots. She had tried everything, looking into payment plans, financial aid, asking for extra shifts, but nothing was enough. Nothing. And now, as she sat there, exhausted and defeated, she felt the weight of helplessness settle over her like a suffocating fog. Then the receptionist called her name. Miss Walker, there's been an update on your mother's account. Sarah's heart dropped. Update, she asked, already bracing herself for bad news. The receptionist typed something on her computer before looking back up. It appears a significant payment has been made toward your mother's surgery costs, almost the entire amount. Sarah's breath hitched. I'm sorry, what? The receptionist pushed a new invoice toward her. The total balance remaining was barely a fraction of what it had been before. Sarah stared at it, her brain struggling to catch up. That can't be right, she murmured. Who paid it? The receptionist shook her head. There's no name attached. It was processed as an anonymous donation. Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. Someone had just erased her biggest problem in a single transaction, without asking for anything in return. And she had no idea who. Across the city, David sat in his office, staring at his phone screen. The confirmation email from the hospital had arrived. The payment had gone through. He exhaled and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He had told himself he wasn't going to get involved. He had told himself this wasn't his problem. But after visiting her former university, after hearing how much she had given up, after seeing the way she desperately fought to fix everything alone, he couldn't not do something. And yet he had no intention of telling her. Sarah was too stubborn, too proud. If she knew, she would never accept it. She would refuse out of sheer principle. So he kept it quiet. He didn't need her gratitude. He just needed to know that, for once, she wouldn't have to fight this battle alone. And that was enough. David barely stepped through the grand entrance of his parents' estate before his mother's voice pierced the air like a blade. David Hadley, explain yourself, he sighed, already knowing exactly where this was going. Seated in the opulent living room, his parents, Richard and Eleanor Hadley, sat with expressions of thinly veiled disappointment. His father was composed, fingers steepled, eyes sharp. His mother, on the other hand, looked downright scandalized, as if he had committed a crime against high society itself. We heard about the charity donation you made, Richard began coolly, swirling the whiskey in his glass. David kept his face blank. I don't recall needing permission to use my own money. Oh, don't be flippant, Eleanor snapped. We know exactly who you gave it to. That girl. David's jaw tightened. Her name is Sarah, he said evenly. His mother waved a dismissive hand. Sarah, whatever. A waitress, David? A woman with nothing to offer you? What are you thinking? I didn't do it for her, David lied smoothly. Her mother needed surgery. That's all. And why should that be your concern? Richard's voice was low, measured. Tell me, David, do you plan on financing the problems of every struggling woman you meet? David's fingers curled slightly against his knee. It was my decision. A foolish one, Eleanor huffed. People like her. Women like her. They latch on, David. You think she isn't aware of your wealth? That she isn't hoping for an opportunity to climb her way out of that pitiful life? David's patience thinned to a razor's edge. Sarah isn't like that, he said, his voice colder now. His mother scoffed. Oh, please, don't be naive. It's embarrassing. Richard, who had been silent for a moment, finally set his drink down. This needs to end, he said firmly. David met his father's gaze. I don't recall agreeing to let you dictate my personal life. You've never needed us to before, Richard continued. You've always understood the responsibility that comes with your position. But this is reckless, sentimental nonsense. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice sharp. You know what people will say, don't you? That the great David Hadley, Harvard-educated, heir to the Hadley legacy, is throwing away his future for some insignificant girl. David's chest tightened. He had spent his entire life under their expectations. He had built himself into someone they respected, someone they could be proud of. But now, for the first time, he realized something. Their pride had always been conditional. Conditional on him fitting into the perfect mold they had carved for him. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Is that what matters to you? He asked, voice quieter now. What people will say? Richard's gaze was unyielding. It matters more than you think. Eleanor crossed her arms. You're going to cut ties with this girl immediately before this gets out of hand. David didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to do what they expected of him. Sarah had been having a terrible week, but she didn't think it could possibly get worse. She was wrong. It started subtly, customers at the daily grind giving her strange looks, some whispering behind their hands when she walked past, others flat out avoiding her. Then came the comments. Did you hear? She was sleeping with a rich guy for money. Apparently, he paid for her mother's surgery. Wonder what she did to earn it. She must be some kind of gold digger, pretending to be a struggling waitress. How pathetic. The first time she heard it, Sarah froze in shock. The second time, her blood boiled. But the third time, she was dragged into the manager's office. Her boss, Greg, a usually laid-back guy, looked at her with thinly veiled disappointment. Sarah, what the hell is going on? Sarah shook her head, still reeling. I don't know. People are saying all these crazy things. Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know what you did, but customers are complaining. They think you're using this place to... God, I don't even want to say it. Sarah felt sick. You don't actually believe them, do you? She asked, voice shaking. Greg hesitated, and that was all the answer she needed. An hour later, she was walking out with a box of her things. Fired. Just like that, for something she didn't even do. And as she stepped outside, rage and humiliation churned inside her, because there was only one possible explanation. David Hadley. She didn't know why. Maybe he had gotten bored. Maybe this had all been some twisted game to him. But he was the only one who knew about the money. He had promised to stay out of it. He had acted like he didn't care. And now everyone thought she was some kind of desperate gold digger. Sarah felt her hands tremble. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number, fury making her pulse race. It barely rang twice before he picked up. Sarah? His voice sounded confused, but Sarah was beyond listening. What the hell did you do? She snapped, her voice shaking with anger. David went silent for half a second. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, David. You! She let out a shaky breath, trying to contain the sheer rage and betrayal burning inside her. I lost my job because of you, because someone spread rumors that I was using you for money. David stiffened on the other end of the line. Sarah, I had nothing to do with... Liar, she hissed. David exhaled sharply. Sarah, listen to me. No, she cut him off. I should have known better. I should have known you'd pull something like this. David felt something twist in his chest. That's not fair, he said tightly. Sarah laughed bitterly. Fair? Are you kidding me? Do you have any idea what you just did to my life? David's grip on his phone tightened. I didn't do this, he said firmly. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was done. I don't ever want to see you again. Then before he could respond, she hung up. David stared at his phone, heart pounding. Something was very, very wrong, because he hadn't done this, which meant someone else had. David sat in his office, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair as he replayed Sarah's words in his head. I don't ever want to see you again. The sheer finality of it made his chest tighten in a way he wasn't used to. And the worst part? She thought it was him. He could have ignored it. He could have let her think whatever she wanted. But something inside him, something that had been slowly unraveling ever since she crashed into his life, wouldn't let this go. Sarah had lost everything because of him, and he was going to fix it. It didn't take long to find out who was behind the rumors. David had spent his entire life surrounded by powerful, ruthless people, and his parents were at the top of that list. They thought they were protecting him. They thought they could control him. But they had made a grave mistake, because they had underestimated how far he was willing to go for Sarah. You're awfully quiet today. David looked up from his seat at the dinner table, his father watching him carefully, wineglass in hand. His mother sat beside him, pretending to be occupied with her salad. But David knew better. He set his fork down. I know what you did. Eleanor sighed, barely glancing at him. You'll have to be more specific, darling. We do many things. David leaned forward, his voice ice cold. You ruined Sarah's life. His father didn't even look surprised. Sarah, Richard repeated flatly. The waitress? The woman you humiliated, David corrected. His mother sighed, placing her napkin down. David, we didn't ruin anything. We simply redirected the situation before it became a real scandal. David's jaw tensed. A scandal? Richard took a sip of his wine. You were being reckless. We did what was necessary to protect your future. David let out a sharp breath. No, you did what was necessary to control me. His mother pursed her lips. David, sweetheart, one day you'll see that this was for the best. David stared at them, truly seeing them for the first time. They would never change, and he was done playing by their rules. He pushed back his chair, standing up abruptly. Where are you going? Richard asked. David met his father's gaze, his voice steady. I'm leaving. Eleanor scoffed. Don't be dramatic, darling. David exhaled sharply. I'm not being dramatic. I'm done. Done letting you dictate my life. Done pretending that I give a damn about your expectations. Richard's eyes darkened. You're making a mistake. No, David said, his voice unwavering. The mistake was thinking I needed you to succeed. His father's grip on his glass tightened. You walk away from this family, and you walk away from everything. The company, the inheritance, all of it. David didn't flinch. Then I'll build something of my own. Eleanor laughed lightly, shaking her head. David, be reasonable. No, David interrupted, his voice calm but absolute. For the first time in my life, I am. And with that, he walked away. From his family, from their power, from the world they had forced him into. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew who he was going to find. The last place Sarah expected to see David Hadley again was at a charity event. But there he was, standing in the middle of a crowded relief site, sleeves rolled up, handing out supplies, looking completely out of place, yet somehow right at home. Sarah had signed up for this volunteer mission weeks ago. After losing her job at the daily grind, she had been trying to reset, refocus, do something that made her feel like herself again. Helping those in need had always grounded her, reminded her why she had once wanted to be a doctor in the first place. But now she was standing 10 feet away from the one person she never wanted to see again, and he was looking right at her. The moment their eyes met, the air shifted, thick with unspoken words, unresolved anger, and something else she couldn't name. For a second, Sarah debated turning around and walking the other way. But before she could move, the event coordinator clapped their hands. "All right, folks, pair up. We've got a long day ahead of us." Sarah barely had time to process those words before someone nudged her shoulder. "Looks like we're working together," came a familiar, infuriatingly smooth voice. Her stomach dropped. She turned, and sure enough, David Hadley stood beside her, arms crossed, a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. Sarah inhaled sharply. "You have got to be kidding me." David, to his credit, looked far too amused. "Trust me, it's not exactly my ideal situation either." She shot him a glare. "Then why are you here?" David's smirk faded slightly. He hesitated, as if debating how much to tell her. "Because I wanted to do something useful," he finally said, voice quieter than she expected. Sarah narrowed her eyes. It wasn't the response she had been expecting. But before she could say anything else, the coordinator called out, "All right, let's get moving. We've got meals to distribute." Sarah gritted her teeth. She had no choice but to work with him. So for the next few hours, they did. At first, they barely spoke. Sarah focused on handing out food, speaking to the people they were helping, making sure everyone got what they needed. David, to her genuine surprise, actually worked. He wasn't standing around giving orders. He wasn't looking at his phone, acting like this was beneath him. He was lifting crates, organizing supplies, kneeling down to talk to kids, even giving away his own jacket to a shivering man who had none. Sarah watched, and for the first time, she saw a different version of David Hadley. Not the arrogant CEO, not the man who ruined her life, but someone who, despite everything, cared, and that terrified her. Because the more she watched, the harder it became to hold on to her anger. And that was dangerous. Sarah sat on the steps of the community center, watching the sky darken into soft shades of orange and purple. The day had been long, physically exhausting, emotionally draining, but she felt lighter than she had in weeks. For the first time in a while, she had done something meaningful again. And despite her best efforts, she couldn't stop thinking about David. Seeing him today, really seeing him, had cracked something inside her. The way he had worked without complaint. The way he had actually listened to the people they were helping. The way he had given without expecting anything in return. It didn't fit with the man she thought she knew. "Hey," a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Mark holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing one over. Sarah smiled. "You're a lifesaver." Mark sat beside her, watching her for a moment before speaking. "So, David Hadley, huh?" Sarah tensed slightly. "What about him?" Mark took a sip of his coffee. "You've spent the entire day pretending not to watch him." Sarah scoffed. "I was not," she sighed. "Okay, maybe a little. But can you blame me? He's confusing as hell." Mark chuckled. "That's one way to put it." There was a pause before Mark's expression turned more serious. "You know he's the one who paid for your mom's surgery, right?" Sarah froze. "What?" she whispered. Mark nodded. "I found out a while ago. I work at the hospital, remember? His name wasn't on the official paperwork, but I put 2 and 2 together. I confronted him about it, and he basically told me to shut up and never mention it." Sarah felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. "No," she said weakly. That doesn't make sense. He never said anything." "Because he didn't want you to know," Mark interrupted gently. "He knew you'd refuse it. And after what happened with his family trashing your name, I think he figured you'd never believe he had good intentions." Sarah's head spun. David Hadley. the man she had hated, the man she had blamed for everything, had been the one who saved her mother's life. And he never asked for credit. She had misjudged him completely. Sarah set down her coffee, suddenly feeling sick. I need to talk to him. She found David leaning against his car in the near-empty parking lot, staring at his phone as if debating whether to get in and leave. David? He looked up, clearly surprised to see her. Sarah? She took a deep breath, stepping closer. I know, she said softly. I know what you did. David stiffened. His expression shifted into something carefully neutral. Mark told you. Sarah nodded. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I didn't do it for recognition, Sarah. I did it because it needed to be done. Sarah swallowed hard. And I blamed you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you were the one who ruined my life. David let out a humorless laugh. Wouldn't have been the first time someone thought that. But it wasn't you, Sarah pressed. It was your family. David looked away, his jaw tightening. Yeah, he admitted, and I should have stopped them sooner. Sarah studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his voice, no deflection, no sharp remarks, just genuine regret. For the first time, she saw not the powerful CEO, not the cold, untouchable businessman, but a man who had tried, failed, and regretted it. David, she said softly, stepping closer. He met her gaze, and for once there was no tension between them. I'm sorry, she whispered. David let out a slow breath. Me too, he said, and this time it wasn't reluctant. It wasn't forced. It was real. David had never been nervous walking into his parents' estate. Not when he was a teenager facing the weight of their expectations. Not when he took over company negotiations that would define his career. Not when he had walked away from it all. But today, as he held Sarah's hand and stepped through the towering front doors, he felt it. Sarah beside him was calm. Too calm. But he knew her well enough now to recognize when she was hiding her nerves. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly as they approached the grand living room. David tightened his grip on her hand. Yes, he said. And if they say one thing that crosses a line, we're walking out, together. Sarah exhaled, nodding. Okay. Then the moment arrived. Richard and Eleanor Hadley were already seated when David led Sarah inside. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line at the sight of her. His father remained impassive, swirling his drink like this was just another business meeting. David, Richard greeted. I assume you have something important to say? David stood tall. I do. His mother glanced at Sarah, expression unreadable. And I assume she is the reason for this meeting? David's gaze didn't waver. Her name is Sarah, and yes, Eleanor sighed dramatically. David, we've been through this. She is the woman I love, David cut in, voice firm and steady. Silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but David didn't falter. He didn't look away, didn't soften his stance. Richard set his glass down with a clink. You're willing to throw away your family, your legacy for this? David exhaled slowly. I didn't throw away anything. I left because I refused to be controlled, and I'm here today because I want you to understand. He looked at Sarah for a brief moment before turning back to them. That this is my choice. She is my choice. And nothing you say will change that. His mother let out a sharp breath. You always were stubborn, she muttered. Richard studied David for a long time, his sharp, calculating gaze searching for weakness. But David wasn't a boy anymore. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg for approval. And that's when something shifted. Richard leaned back, folding his arms. You really mean this? I do, David said without hesitation. Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, Eleanor sighed and shook her head. Well, at least she has a backbone. I suppose that's something. Sarah blinked, unsure if that was an insult or a compliment. Richard exhaled. I won't pretend to approve, David, but he looked between them, gaze thoughtful. I see that stopping you would be pointless. David raised an eyebrow. That almost sounded like acceptance. Richard let out a humorless chuckle. It sounded like reality. Eleanor pursed her lips before finally turning to Sarah. I assume you're not going anywhere? Sarah met her gaze evenly. No, ma'am. A pause. Then to everyone's surprise, Eleanor gave the faintest hint of a smirk. At least you're honest. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't approval. But it was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. As David and Sarah left hand in hand, he looked at her with a small smile. You survived, he teased. Sarah exhaled dramatically. Barely, he chuckled, pulling her closer. It's over now. She smiled back, resting her head against his shoulder. No, it's just beginning. Sarah stood in front of Westbridge Medical School, staring up at the familiar stone facade. It had been years since she last walked through those doors, since she had packed up her dreams and set them aside for survival. But today she was back. She tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack, her heart pounding. Nervous? She turned to find David standing beside her with his hands in his pockets, watching her with a knowing smirk. No, she lied. David raised an eyebrow. Right, that's why you've been standing here for 5 minutes instead of walking inside. Sarah exhaled sharply. Okay, fine. Maybe a little. David's smirk softened into something gentler. You've got this, Sarah. She looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had once been her worst enemy, then her biggest frustration, and now he was her greatest supporter. Thanks, David, she said, meaning it more than she could ever explain. He shrugged. Just don't become a better doctor than me. Sarah rolled her eyes. You're not a doctor. David smirked. Exactly. So it should be easy. She laughed, shaking her head before turning toward the entrance. And this time she walked inside without hesitation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, David Hadley sat in an empty office space, staring at the blank walls and envisioning the future. He had walked away from his family's empire. He had left behind everything they built. But he wasn't starting from scratch. No, he was building something better, something his own. And as he leaned back in his chair, scrolling through the draft of his new company's business plan, his phone buzzed. Sarah. First day done, I only mildly wanted to die. David chuckled. David. Sounds promising. Guess I won't invest in a backup career for you just yet. Sarah's reply came instantly. Sarah, I hate you. Sarah, thanks for believing in me. David's smirk softened. David, always. For the first time in a long time, they were both exactly where they were meant to be. The day Sarah had been waiting for finally arrived. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her white coat, the embroidered letters on the pocket catching her eye. Dr. Sarah Walker. She ran her fingers over the stitching, barely believing it was real. After years of struggle, sacrifice, and uncertainty, she had made it. She had fought for this moment, and she wasn't alone. Are you just going to stare at yourself all day? Or are we actually leaving? Sarah turned toward the doorway, where David leaned against the frame, arms crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. She rolled her eyes. Excuse me for wanting to appreciate the fact that I'm finally a doctor. David chuckled. You earned it. Sarah sighed, giving him a playful smirk. I suppose I should thank you, considering you did kind of finance my comeback. David shrugged. I prefer to see it as an investment in a future world-class doctor. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. And yet, somehow, you're still the most insufferable person I know. And yet, David mimicked, stepping closer, you still keep me around. Sarah didn't argue, because he was right. A year later, the Hadley Walker Free Clinic opened its doors for the first time. It stood in the heart of the city, a place for those who had nowhere else to turn. Sarah ran the medical side, treating patients, making sure they received the care they deserved. David handled the business, funding, logistics, operations, ensuring that no one ever got turned away because they couldn't afford treatment. Together, they had built something that mattered. Together, they had turned pain into purpose. On the clinic's first day, Sarah stood beside David, watching as the doors opened and patients began to walk in. We did it, she murmured. David glanced at her. Of course we did. Did you really doubt us? Sarah shot him a playful look. You? Always, David smirked. And yet you love me anyway. Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled softly. Yeah, I do. He grinned, slipping his hand into hers. Good, because I'm never letting you get rid of me. Sarah squeezed his hand, watching as their clinic, their dream, came to life. They had fought, broken apart, found their way back together. They had defied expectations, proven people wrong, built something from nothing. And now they had forever.